On a gray autumn afternoon in late 1944, a Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress of the United States 8th Air Force limped back toward its base in East Anglia, England, its landing gear frozen in the wells and its systems scarred by German flak. Below lay the familiar patchwork of British fields and hard surface runways, but for this crew there was no such thing as a normal landing anymore. The aircraft had just returned from a deep raid into occupied Europe, part of the relentless strategic bombing campaign that sent hundreds of flying fortresses against rail yards, oil plants, and industrial centers every week. Now, with fuel running low and the undercarriage jammed, the pilot faced a choice every bomber crew dreaded: attempt a full wheels-up belly landing in a 30-ton, 4-engine giant. What happened over the next tense hour would test not only his flying skill, but the trust and courage of every man on board, and would be remembered on that airfield long after the war ended. By late 1944, the B-17 Flying Fortress had become the symbol of American air power over Europe. Designed as a high-altitude, long-range heavy bomber, the B-17G variant carried up to 6,000 pounds of bombs on long missions and bristled with multiple .50 caliber machine guns in nose, dorsal, waist, tail, and ball turret positions. The 8th Air Force, operating out of a network of airfields across East Anglia, had committed entire bomb wings of these aircraft to daylight precision attacks against the German war machine. The aircraft in this story belonged to one of the many B-17 groups flying from an English base of concrete runways, blister hangars, and Nissen hut barracks spread around the countryside. Its crew was typical: 10 men, most in their early 20s, wearing olive drab or heavy sheepskin flying gear, each with a specific job and a shared fate. In the left seat sat a first lieutenant aircraft commander, responsible for the lives of his crew and the safety of a machine that represented months of work and thousands of man-hours. Beside him, the co-pilot handled power, trim, and instruments. Behind them, the navigator tracked their position across the North Sea and into Germany, aided by charts and radio beacons, while the bombardier, crouched over the Norden bomb site in the nose, had guided the aircraft through flak on the bomb run. Further back, the flight engineer manned the top turret, watching engine temperatures and fuel, while gunners in the waist, tail, and the cramped Sperry ball turret scanned the sky for enemy fighters. That day's target lay deep inside occupied territory, a rail yard and industrial area tied to Germany's vital transport network, guarded by concentric belts of heavy 88mm and 105mm flak guns, directed by radar and sound ranging. The timing mattered. Allied planners in 1944 were determined to cripple fuel and transport before the final offensives into the heart of the Reich, so every raid carried strategic weight far beyond a single crew or aircraft. Each mission meant flying straight and level through black bursts of flak for minutes at a time, trusting armor plate, formation discipline, and sheer luck. For the men of this B-17, the morning began like so many others. A pre-dawn briefing under harsh electric light, a map on the wall covered in strings and pins, and blunt casualty estimates that reminded them how many crews, statistically, would not return. They had flown previous missions together and already seen friends fail to come back, their places at the mess tables taken by new faces, or left empty. What none of them knew that morning was that the most dangerous minutes of this mission would not be over the target, but over their own home field. Over the target, everything followed a now familiar pattern of terror and routine. As the formation approached bomb release altitude, German flak batteries around the rail hub opened up, throwing up dense curtains of black bursts at 20,000 to 25,000 feet. The B-17 shuddered as near misses peppered its wings and fuselage with shrapnel, several fragments punching into the underside near the wing roots and belly. Inside the aircraft, the noise was a mixture of roaring engines, wind leakage, the clatter of guns, and the metallic thump of flak. The ball turret gunner, suspended in his plexiglass sphere beneath the fuselage, felt the shock of a close burst reverberate through the turret's ring as the bomber rocked. The engineer called out engine temperatures and fuel states, his eyes flicking to the instrument showing system pressures. At bombs away, the aircraft jolted slightly as the load fell, the bombardier announcing impact seconds over the interphone. The pilot eased the aircraft back into formation, banking away from the target as more flak followed them along the withdrawal route. Only as the formation turned west, heading back toward England, did the crew begin the full damage check. By around 1400 hours, as the B-17 crossed the German frontier and headed for the North Sea, the engineer noticed something worrying. The hydraulic brake pressure and associated gauges were acting erratically, fluctuating in a way that suggested damage. At first, it seemed like just another entry in a long list of minor hits. After all, the B-17's main landing gear were electrically driven, with hydraulics used for systems like brakes and cowl flaps, and combat crews were used to flying home with damage. But, as time went on, more warning signs appeared. The ball turret gunner reported stiff movement in his traverse and elevation gears, and the engineer noticed streaks under the fuselage when he leaned into the top turret to look down the sides of the aircraft. In the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot discussed whether to test the landing gear early, but standard practice was to keep the wheels up until closer to base to minimize drag and fuel burn. They noted the issue and pressed on, wanting to get home before weather over England deteriorated. Crossing the North Sea, they flew through scattered cloud, the horizon an indistinct gray line where water met sky. Radio reports indicated worsening conditions over parts of East Anglia, with low cloud and intermittent drizzle. The pilot mentally rehearsed approaches to his familiar concrete runway, knowing it well in clear weather, but not yet imagining what the day still had in store. By the time the English coast came into view, fuel states were acceptable but not luxurious, and the formation had started to break up as groups and squadrons peeled off for their respective airfields. It was around this point that the crew decided to run a controlled systems check while still in the air. The engineer was ordered to test the gear operation briefly, just enough to confirm response, not to extend fully. He selected the gear control. Nothing moved. The familiar whine of the electric motors driving the big main legs failed to sound, and the indicator lights stayed stubbornly in the up position. The pilot had the engineer try again, checking circuit breakers and verifying power feeds. Still nothing. A more careful inspection revealed further issues. Flak fragments had not only damaged hydraulic lines but likely sheared or jammed portions of the gear drive and wiring harnesses running through the wing roots and belly. By now they were within a short flight of their home base in East Anglia. The pilot called the tower, reported, "Returning from mission, combat damage, possible gear problem," and requested priority for a straight-in approach and troubleshooting time. The tower acknowledged calmly, but on the ground, controllers and crash crews knew exactly what those words might mean. As the B-17 entered the airfield's vicinity and joined a holding pattern, the pilot and engineer attempted the emergency extension procedures. In the B-17, besides the electric motors, there were manual crank and free-fall options to help get the gear down if the primary system failed. The engineer and other crew members took turns at the hand cranks, muscles straining in the cramped interior as they tried to overcome whatever obstruction flak had created. Minutes dragged by. The tower asked for a low pass so ground observers could visually inspect the gear. Around 1500 hours, the bomber descended and roared down the runway at a few hundred feet, engines throttled up, as eyes on the ground and binoculars fixed on the wheel wells. The verdict was grim. From the tower and runway edges, ground crews saw the gear doors askew and hydraulic staining under the belly, but no sign of wheels emerging. Both main legs appeared locked fully up, with the tail wheel also retracted. There would be no normal landing today. Inside, tension thickened. The pilot ordered everyone to check parachutes and stow loose equipment. The ball turret gunner, who knew the horror stories of gunners trapped during belly landings, focused on fully retracting and locking his turret to give himself a chance to get clear. For nearly 10 more minutes, while the aircraft circled at low altitude, The engineer and waist gunners fought with the internal cranks and linkages that helped position the turret and access panels. Each minute burned fuel and brought darkness and worsening weather a little closer. Little did they know, on the ground men were already lining the perimeter track, expecting to see disaster unfold before their eyes. By 15:15 hours, fuel calculations turned from caution to critical. They could not wait much longer. It was time to decide how to bring this gearless flying fortress down. The crisis now was absolute. The tower confirmed that every attempt to lower the landing gear had failed, and observers again reported that all wheels were still fully retracted. Given damage to the systems and time remaining, there was no realistic prospect of further in-air repairs. A harsh option loomed: ordering some of the crew to bail out over the countryside while a skeleton team stayed aboard to attempt the landing. The idea was discussed briefly over the interphone, each man knowing that low-altitude jumps over farms and hedgerows carried their own risks of broken bones or worse. There was also the question of leaving wounded or pinned crew behind, a moral weight no one wanted to shoulder. In many documented B-17 emergencies, commanders chose to keep the crew together where possible, trusting in coordinated action and the ruggedness of the airframe. Here, the pilot made his decision. They would remain as a crew and ride the bomber down together. Fear gripped the men, but no one openly challenged the call. The ball turret gunner had by this point been cranked back into the fuselage and was out of his exposed position. He sat on the floor, parachute harness tight, listening to the clipped, almost unnaturally calm exchanges between pilot, engineer, and tower. Somewhere under the fear there was a quiet relief. At least he was no longer suspended in a sphere that would be the first point of contact with the runway. The tower cleared all other traffic away. Emergency vehicles lined the sides of the main runway, crash trucks, fire tenders, and ambulances in positions calculated to respond quickly while staying out of the bomber's potential slide path. Non-essential personnel near dispersal bays and hangars close to the runway were moved back, open spaces cleared in case the bomber veered off course. The station commander and senior flying control officers gathered in the tower, binoculars and radios in hand. They had seen accidents before: B-17 breaking in two, landing gear collapsing, fuel tanks rupturing into flames. But a fully gear-up landing of a heavy bomber was still something rare and deeply feared. On board, the pilot laid out the final plan. He would make a shallow, power-on approach at the lowest safe airspeed, holding the aircraft just above the runway as long as he could to bleed off energy before letting the belly touch. He warned the crew to expect a violent, grinding impact, followed by a long slide and potential fires. Everyone took crash positions. The navigator and bombardier braced themselves in the nose, away from glass where possible, maps and equipment secured. Waist gunners lay flat on the floor or against bulkheads, chutes under them for extra cushioning, while the radio operator cinched his harness until it cut into his shoulders. At around 15:25 hours, the pilot turned the B-17 onto final approach. Clouds still hung low over the field, the runway only fully visible in the last moments as they burst from the gray. Throttle settings were fine-tuned, each engine monitored for power and response. Any sudden failure now could cause asymmetric thrust and spin them into disaster. At 1,000 feet, the co-pilot called out airspeed and altitude in a steady rhythm. 120 miles per hour, 110. The pilot aimed to arrive just above stall speed, trading margin for a softer impact, but not so slow that a wing would drop. The runway, slick with recent drizzle, offered both a curse and a blessing. Less friction for stopping, but also less chance of the aircraft digging in and flipping. At 500 feet, hearts pounded in every position of the aircraft. The engines hummed at low power, the nose slightly raised, the aircraft still floating toward the threshold. From the tower, the sight was unforgettable. A big four-engine bomber, clean-bellied, coming in as if someone had forgotten to extend the wheels. At 200 feet, there was no turning back. The pilot eased the throttles back further, holding the nose just high enough to present the belly rather than the props to the runway. A few seconds later, the concrete filled the windscreen. The first contact was a sickening metallic howl. The keel and lower fuselage struck the runway, aluminum scraping and tearing, sending a sheet of sparks streaming behind the bomber. Inside, men were thrown forward against belts and improvised padding, some feeling teeth rattle as the impact ripped through the airframe. Almost instantly, the outboard propellers bit the concrete. Blades bent and snapped, engines wrenched from their ideal positions, cowlings grinding away in showers of metal. Miraculously, there was no immediate fuel explosion. Self-sealing tanks and luck combined to hold the precious gasoline inside the wings. For several terrifying seconds, the bomber skidded down the runway. The right wing dipped slightly as an engine mount dug in, threatening to pivot the whole aircraft into a ground loop. The pilot fought the controls, using what little aileron and rudder authority remained at the decaying speed to keep the nose aligned. Finally, with a long, final shriek of metal, the B-17 came to a halt off to one side of the runway, partly on grass, engines dead, belly flattened, and a faint haze of smoke rising from hot brakes and scorched paint. Silence followed. A silence broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the ragged breathing of 10 men who were astonished to find themselves still alive. In the shock-filled seconds after the slide stopped, training and instinct kicked back in. The pilot called for a quick verbal head count over the interphone. Navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio, waist, tail, ball turret. One by one, shaken but conscious voices responded. The ball turret gunner, now safely inside the fuselage rather than crushed beneath it, reported bruises and a pounding heart, but no broken bones. For him especially, the reality of having survived what could have been a death sentence felt almost unreal. He had just ridden a 30-ton aircraft down on its stomach and walked away. The pilot and co-pilot began shutting down what was left of the systems, fuel mixtures to idle cut off where levers still moved, magnetos off where reachable, battery and master switches as intact wiring allowed. They shouted to the men behind them to open hatches and prepare to evacuate, wary of any hint of fuel leaks or sparks. Fuselage doors and roof hatches were forced or kicked open, each movement sending new groans through the stressed metal. Outside, crash trucks and fire crews had already begun to race down the runway. The first vehicles arrived within moments, men in crash gear fanning out with extinguishers, hoses, and stretchers, scanning for flames along the scraped underside and shattered engines. Seeing only smoke and no open fire, they moved to the exits, helping crew members down from the battered hulk. As the airmen stepped onto the damp grass, some limped, some staggered, and a few simply dropped to their knees, clutching the earth. They had braced for a violent roll or fire, and instead found themselves